This is Ava McCollum for her report on her engagement project for Political Science 120, or 12-0, however you want to say it. My question is, what political and social forces shape Canadian identity? So, I chose 4 things. You can't see it here, but government and political values, Indigenous peoples and reconciliation, social movements and change, multiculturalism, and immigration. Indigenous people and reconciliation. So, I believe that it's a very firm part of our society and culture because Indigenous people have always existed in Canada and they've been here longer, like way longer than us. And we need to acknowledge that. We have Truth and Reconciliation Day to acknowledge what the Indigenous had to endure and celebrate their culture. Indigenous people and reconciliation. So this year we have before and after. So in the early or late 18,000s, and then I think this one here was 2017, 2015. This is when Every Child Matters movement happened. So the execution of Indians ought to convince the red man that the white man governs. McDonald's, 1885. And then recently, we honor the Indigenous children who were sent to residential schools and pledged to work together to ensure that every child matters. Now, this here is just showing like how our country has changed and how our views and values have changed. Indigenous people and reconciliation. We have acknowledged the heinous genocide that has occurred on Canadian land, and we've acknowledged that the heinous. Oh no. Okay, so this here is supposed to say, I know I probably should double check this, it's very late, but it's supposed to say like 251 children were found in the British Columbia residential school, and that might not seem like a big number, but altogether in Canada, more than 150,000 children have attended Indian residential schools. So every child matters. Indigenous people and reconciliation. So national values. Indigenous nations existed long before Canada. Treaties, residential schools, and colonization deeply shape Canada's history. And modern efforts towards reconciliation, like land acknowledgement and truth and reconciliation, influence Canadian identity. Because without the Indigenous, we wouldn't have been able to support who we are today. Social movements and change. Feminism and LGBTQ rights. Okay, so feminism. It wasn't always inclusive. Back in the day, women weren't able to vote, and it only happened in 1918. But even then, it wasn't every province. Manitoba was really bad. I think there was 1922. The Northwest Territories was the 1950s, and Quebec only allowed women to vote in 1940. When the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created, women were given more equal rights as well. But you have to think there was a lot of time, or a long time, where women didn't have rights because the Charter of Rights only came out in the 1980s. And there was a lot of stigma back in the day between that time where women shouldn't work, women shouldn't be able to do this, that, you know. Silly things to think about today because so much has changed. And then for the LGBTQ, for much of Canadian history, same-sex relationships were criminalized. This idea was mainly brought through Catholicism, religion. We'll just say religion. We don't have to name call anybody. And then in 1969, the government decriminalized homosexual acts between consenting adults, reflecting a shift towards personal freedom. This change showed that Canada is beginning to define itself as a country that respects privacy and individual rights. Then again, this is another equality right? Social movements and change. Canada, Toronto hosts like a giant pride events. There's media representation, and in schools we have normalized LGBTQ plus identities. There is more of a public acceptance. I'm not saying everybody accepts it, but there are more public acceptance to LGBTQ rights that reflects a Canadian value and inclusion with diversity. Feminism has made gender equality a national priority and not just a social idea. Feminism has came a long way, especially the women's suffrage movement and the stages that women have to go through. And even when feminism first began, it wasn't all women, it was just white women, and there was a giant block for any colored lady. And this shapes Canada's identity as a country that values fairness, diversity, social progress, and even as challenges remained, we are still fighting them today. Government and political values. Canada is a democratic country that uses a parliamentary system. We value having the right to vote in our federal, provincial, and even our municipal governments, and we get to vote in our leaders. This here, I have a small showing of like NDP, Conservative, LeBlanc, Liberal, and one and only Mark Carney. We are fortunate to have our Charters of Rights, which protects us as Canadians from inhumane incidents. Incidents is a weird word. I didn't know what else to use, but I mean, we have the right to mobility, we have the freedom of expression, we have the right life, liberty, and security of oneself. We have the right, not the right of inhumane torture, the right to not be inhumanely tortured. And I put in brackets because even though provinces bypass this with the notwithstanding clause, like what Alberta is doing with the transgenderism right now, and not the Bloc, Quebec is doing with religious symbols in government buildings, which would be freedom of expression. Multiculturalism and immigration. Canada has a long history with immigration, from the European settlers to the most recent waves with Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. We have so many different people from different regions coming in, and we're accepting them. Immigration shapes Canada's population, economy, and cities. Without immigration, we would not be able to support ourselves whatsoever. And people need to understand that. Immigration contributes to our food, music, religion, traditions, and making Canada culturally diverse. We have Ramadan, actually, it's really cool, we're having a Buddhist, not a Buddhist house, but like a Buddhist temple being built in PEI right now, and it is gigantic. I was fortunate to see it because my father is actually working on it. And it's just showing how much we are changing as a country because we're building these things for other people, for different cultures, to be more accepting of them. In my conclusion, Canadian identity is shaped by political and social forces that have challenged and defined the nation. The fight for gender and LGBTQ plus equality, the strength of multicultural communities, and the resilience of Indigenous people, and the influence of the government policies that show how struggles for justice, recognition, and inclusive shape who we are as a country. By understanding these forces, we can see that Canadian identity is not fixed, but is built through courage, diversity, and the ongoing work to create a society that values every voice. I think Canada is a very diverse country, and we do a lot for everybody. Especially Susan Holt has a new accessibility, not an act, but she's trying to make more government buildings accessible for everybody. And I think that's just amazing. Or even family planning clinics. When Blaine Higgs was in, there was only 2. And now there's 9, I believe, since Susan Holt's been in. My hope is to see Canada change and adapt even more. At 17, I feel like I've seen so much when it comes to multiculturalism or the LGBT community. I live in, I don't know if I should say because I'm posting on YouTube, but I live in a very small community where there isn't a lot of diversity, and it's a senior town with very strong values. And since I've lived here, I've seen so much change. I've seen so many people move in, especially since COVID, and my community was forced to adapt, and it was amazing to see. and I want that to happen more. I want to see a Canada where everybody is accepted. Thank you. This is my report for my action project, or my engagement project. And I hope you enjoyed it.